the billions now that is being spent by United States, including NATO countries like Canada, to make Ukraine the most corrupt country in the world into a Jeffersonian democracy. It is a laundromat for the military-industrial complex in America. How did this happen? It didn't happen overnight. What happened was the derailment began with the decision of Truman.
Salim Mansur of Western University joins us today to discuss the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, this being August. He has published an extensive paper on the subject on Substack. You can see that there, salimmansur.substack.com. And it's very intriguing in light of what we're now coming to know about America's deep state and their continued hatred for all things Russian. So tying in today's events of the war in Ukraine, the movement of the doomsday clock to 90 seconds before midnight just this year, and the looming threat of nuclear war, the continued involvement of the United States in affairs outside of their borders. Let's look back then to the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan, where over 200,000 civilians died. And Salim, please tell us about your essay and your thesis.
Well, Robert, just about every year, as August rolls around, there is a burst of rethinking, debate, arguments that erupts, at least in America, as if in a ritual to go through the rights and wrongs of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945. This is the 78th anniversary. So we are looking back almost 80 years to an event. So presentism is unavoidable. The challenge always for a historian, a serious person, is to get back into the situation surrounding, that is the context surrounding that event, that decision, those people, you know. So to understand 1945, we have to get into 1945. But that's history, you know, that's happened, it's over. But the events that happen keeps on producing consequences and effects. History can be said, and it is said, is the consequences of consequences, and particularly the unintended consequences. So for instance, the A-bomb was used in one set of argument, that is the argument of President Truman, the man who made the decision. He was the president of the United States. He was the war leader. To bring an end to the war without having to invade Japan, which would have led to a huge number of American casualties. Some estimates went up to 1 million casualties. Okay, so that was the argument that led to President Truman's decision to use the A-bomb. And so in using the A-bomb, the war came to an end. Within a week after the bombing of Nagasaki on August 9th, there was a bombing of Hiroshima on August 6th, and then 3 days later, the bombing of Nagasaki on August 9th. And within a week, on August 15th, Japan surrendered. So in that sense, the matter was over. We are in 2023, and what is intriguing that led me, or led anyone who is interested in this matter, to go back to understand what not only transpired in the making of the decision, but what were the consequences and the unintended consequences that we have arrived at. For instance, the question or the issue that interests me is here we are in 2023. At the beginning of 2023, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, the leading journal of physicists and scientists, it was among the founding members of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists was Einstein and the people in the Manhattan Project. So they have the doomsday clock. And at the beginning of this year, the hands of the doomsday clock was moved to 90 seconds to midnight. That's the closest the hands have been moved to midnight, midnight being the hour when the world might come to an end to a nuclear Armageddon. The hands were not moved to within 90 seconds during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis was 60 years ago. So why was it moved? How have we come about to this position? Because the moving of the nuclear doomsday hands is as a result of the proxy war in Ukraine, a war that is being financed, armed, and supported by the United States and NATO against Russia. Russia was a principal ally of the United States in the Second World War, which most American, if not all American, thinks was not only the greatest war that America fought, but it was the just war. So here we are, 78 years later, 60 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Once again, the Americans are eyeball to eyeball in a possible nuclear war. So that's the question. How did we arrive at this position? When the Soviet Union was America's major ally, and we'll get into that. And the second thing is, this is the 60th anniversary of the killing of President John F. Kennedy. Why was President John F. Kennedy killed? Well, he was the president after the Cuban Missile Crisis who reached out to his counterpart, the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, to begin to work out a relationship which he set up the objective for, the hope for, the vision for, the peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union and nuclear disarmament, because he was the president who came eyeball to eyeball with the possibility of a nuclear exchange, President Kennedy, and he was killed. So those two events, the killing of President Kennedy and the present situation that we find ourselves in, where we are once again, eyeball to eyeball, that is, Americans are eyeball to eyeball in a possible escalation of the war in Ukraine, the proxy war in Ukraine that was launched or that began technically February of 2022 with the special military operation of the Russian armed forces under Putin, but which dates back to, at least 30 years since the end of the Cold War with the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And so here we are. And your opening remarks about this anti-Russian sentiment that is sweeping across the West once again. And here we are in Canada. It's the same. There's no rational, historical, objective discussions about this, but it is Russia is the bad guy. And, this war in Ukraine is a just war. Without getting into the details of why it is a just war, what has led to this war, when most of the world outside of the North American complex and European complex, that is NATO countries, the rest of the world have a completely different opinion. So those, Robert, were the germane question that led me to go back to 1948 to try to find out or understand the genesis, the origin of what we find ourselves in, this continuing enmity, animus towards Russia and the Russian people on the one hand, and what has happened to America, what Eisenhower talked about at the end of his term as president in his favorite address in January of 1961, warning Americans as he left the White House about the military-industrial complex.
This conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The very next president was murdered, killed, assassinated by the military-industrial complex. But my interest was to understand and explain, to find the basis, the origin, and I'm repeating myself, on the two related issues, which is our time. One is the Ukraine war that is going on. One is the 60th anniversary of the killing of John F. Kennedy. This is the 60th anniversary. Where and how did this come about? What is the genesis? And it leads anyone to go, the necessity to go back to that period, the end of Second World War. Because at the end of Second World War, and in this case, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the decision to use the bomb, in a sense, broke the alliance that was there, that was built so carefully. I'm using these words myself very carefully. It was the wartime alliance that was built. That is, war brought two countries, two powers to become allies. United States under President Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and Soviet Union under Stalin. Now, President Roosevelt was not uninformed that the Soviet Union was a communist country and Stalin was a dictator. And Stalin was not uninformed that President Roosevelt is four-time elected president of the greatest Western power at that time, and has since become, it was the economic, financial power that once it started focusing upon the war, once it entered into the war, it became what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. As President Eisenhower in his favorite address said, before the Second World War, America did not have an armaments industry to talk about. It was not a military power in that sense. But after World War II, or when World War II ended, America was the greatest military power, the greatest armaments industry. And now with the atomic bomb, America was a nuclear power when no one else was a nuclear power. That was one of the greatest and most complex work, the Manhattan Project. People talk about the Manhattan Project this year. The movie Oppenheimer is showing Robert Oppenheimer, who was the director of the Los Alamos laboratory where the design of the bomb was made, and so on and so forth set up. But it was a massive engineering project. That project would not have been done, would not have been invested in. $2 billion was spent in putting the Manhattan Project together by America. $2 billion in the 1940s money is today in excess of $20 billion. Now, no government would have put in that sort of money to create that sort of an industrial complex to produce a nuclear bomb if it was not for the war. The Germans were trying it out, and they couldn't go ahead with it. The British were trying it out. They couldn't go ahead with it, And after the war, Stalin and Russia would invest everything that they had, and sacrifice everything that they had to get the A-bomb so that they would be equal to, in terms of weapon, with what was their ally was now turning out to become their enemy. Because the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not the bombing to end the war, and that's something that we need to discuss, and that's where the dispute is. But it was, as Einstein himself pointed out, it was the opening shot of what became the Cold War.
Let me just quote something from your paper here, Salim, which underlies that. You talk about James Burns, who was the Secretary of State under Truman, and he used to be Truman's mentor in the Senate as well. And that's a relationship that's very germane to why Truman would defer to Burns. But Burns said he let it be known to Szilard and his companions that the A-bomb was not needed for Japanese surrender, but to make Russia more manageable in Europe. This was a view Burns also discussed with Truman, that the A-bomb would position the United States to dictate terms after the war. That's chilling. If that is absolutely true, and it certainly has a ring of truth to it, then what Truman did was incinerate 200,000 Japanese to put the fear of God into Russia. Not to end the war in Japan, because they were going to capitulate anyway. The Allied invasion, land invasion, was only supposed to start November 1st, as you've told me, months down the road. And they would have expected, the generals were saying that Japan was going to surrender within weeks anyway. So the A-bomb was not needed except for Truman to put the fear of God into Russia.
Yeah, that's exactly what people said. Einstein said it. Einstein was the man who wrote the letter to President Roosevelt in 1939, the letter that was drafted by his fellow scientist, Leo Szilard, that you just mentioned, a Hungarian emigre into America. Einstein was a German emigre into America in the 1930s. So it was Einstein's letter that got President Roosevelt thinking about it when the war broke out. And then when Pearl Harbor was bombed and America entered the war, President Roosevelt ordered his people, that is his military people, to start this project, Manhattan Project, which was a highly secret project, and in fact, Truman, who was President Roosevelt's running mate in the 1944 election. Truman was in the Senate. He was a senator from Missouri. President Roosevelt's people selected Truman to be his running mate. Truman did not know about the Manhattan Project. It is only on the death of President Roosevelt on April the 12th, 1945, that evening, the evening that Roosevelt died, President Roosevelt died in Warm Spring, Georgia, on April 12, 1945, sometime in the mid-afternoon, late afternoon. And in the evening, a few hours later, Vice President Truman was sworn in as the president, as the 33rd president. And after the swearing in, according to his biographers, Truman asked all those who were present in the White House, that is, the cabinet members of President Roosevelt, to stay behind. And they stayed behind, and Truman spoke to them, and Truman said that he will be fully committed to follow and implement the programs and policies of President Roosevelt. And he asked all of the members there of the President Roosevelt's cabinet to remain in their job. He requested that they remain, and so they remained. And when that meeting finished, Henry Stimson, who was the Secretary of War for President Roosevelt, he asked for a private word with President Truman. So when everybody left the Oval Office, Stimson stayed behind, and then Stimson informed President Truman about this gadget. That was the code word, that they're working on a gadget which is highly secretive, and that's all that he is at the present moment able to tell him. That was April 12, 1945. So even President Truman, who becomes the president, didn't know about the Manhattan Project. It was such a guarded secret. So yes, I mean, quickly, if you go through the timeline, which is very, very crucial in explaining what happened, President Roosevelt had just come back from Yalta Conference, February of 1945. That was the last major conference that President Roosevelt traveled to. This was in Crimea, where the war is going on right now. And Yalta, the seaport in Crimea, or the resort where the conference was held. President Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of England, or Great Britain, and Stalin. That's the big three. They were meeting for the final shaping of the conclusion of the war. Many different issues are on the agenda, but the two most important issues that takes President Roosevelt, I mean, he left for Yalta 2 days after his inauguration in the fourth term. January of 1945, he's inaugurated for his fourth term. The election has taken place in November of 1944. January of 1945, 20th January 1945, the inauguration takes place. 2 days later, he sails for Yalta. He arrives in Yalta on February the 3rd, and the conference begins on February the 4th. The two things that is most important in President Roosevelt's mind is to get the final commitment from Stalin about when Stalin is going to make the decision to attack Japan. During this entire period from Pearl Harbor, 1941, till Yalta, 1945, the Pacific War is going on. That is, America and Japan are engaged in the war. And of course, Britain is there as part of the British Empire, is there in the Pacific. But it is basically Japan and America at war. Soviet Union has a non-aggression pact with Japan, and Soviet Union is not at war with Japan. Soviet Union is focused upon the war in Europe, Germany, Italy. Okay, so President Roosevelt is traveling this great distance. Just imagine, this man is now sick, fragile, feeble, and yet he's traveling this great distance by sea to get the final word. When will Stalin open the front with Japan? Stalin makes his commitment. Stalin says, the moment the war against Germany ends, Germany surrenders, within 3 months, we'll launch the war against Japan. We'll end the non-aggression pact. So he gets the commitment. The second thing, which is for Roosevelt the most important, Roosevelt is now thinking about the world after the war. That is the structure of peace. Here is a man, and in fact, all three of them, they were 20 years younger when the First World War broke out. And Roosevelt was very much in the war. He was the Assistant Secretary of Navy in the Woodrow Wilson government. In effect, he was running the Navy. The secretary is a political appointment. He's also a political appointment, but the assistant secretary is the man who's running the Navy. For instance, just a historical note for people. In Pearl Harbor, the big battleship cruiser, among several, that was destroyed by the Japanese was the USS cruiser Arizona, and it is still remembered. Arizona, that was the ship in Hawaii. The hulk of Arizona is now the museum piece for the Pearl Harbor Museum. Well, Arizona was Roosevelt's baby. He laid the keel for Arizona during World War I. Okay, so here they are in Yalta. Churchill was the first Lord of Admiralty for the British, and Stalin came to, was one of the leading members of the Bolshevik that had the revolution, led the revolution in 1917 in the midst of the World War I, right? So all three of them were there. 20 plus years later, they're back again in a world war. And the critical point is for Roosevelt, what will be the structure of peace that another generation then does not have to face this sort of world war? And that structure of peace is the United Nations that he has worked out and he's going to launch. And he needs Stalin's commitment to be on board the negotiation. And they both agree, along with Churchill, that the big three must remain united so that the world can be at peace and that structure of peace can be established. And to maintain that unitedness, there has to be unanimity of decision-making at the United Nations. And for that, each of the big three will have a veto power, okay? Because that was the sticking point. How will we work together? So if something goes against the interests of any one of the big three, that big three will have the veto power to say, no, we won't go forward with this. We have to have the unanimity. And Roosevelt wanted that, and Roosevelt got it. Soviet Union was given the veto power, Britain was given the veto power, and America had the veto power. Later, that veto power would be extended to France and to China. But that was the aim. And he comes back to back home, Washington, and then within a matter, on 1st of March, he gives a speech to the joint session of the Congress and tells them what has happened. But he never tells them that Stalin has now committed himself to go to war against Japan, because that would tip off the Japanese. But he tells them exactly, that this is all has been set up, and we go forward. And then he goes for a break and he dies. So within a matter of 5 weeks or 6 weeks after coming back from Yalta, President Roosevelt dies, and Truman becomes the president. Okay, so the question is, Truman becomes the president. He's going to follow the policies of Roosevelt on all issues, and it is now the end game. If you use the analogy of a chess, there is the opening part of the game or war, then there's the middle part, the middle game, and then there's the end game. The opening phase and the middle game has been played out by Roosevelt for America. And the critical decision that Roosevelt has made, America will be the arsenal of democracy. When America did not go into the war until Pearl Harbor, 41, Roosevelt brought up this policy of Lend-Lease. America is supposed to be a neutral country. He could have been impeached by the Congress. What he was doing, he was sending American equipment, armament, whatever America had from World War I or whatever little that was being produced. He was sending that first to Britain, That was the Lend-Lease agreement that Roosevelt and Churchill met for in your part of the Canada, in Argentia, Newfoundland, and that's where the Lend-Lease agreement and the Atlantic Charter was signed. And he was sending them once Germany invaded Russia or Soviet Union in June of 1941. He was providing, America was providing, Roosevelt was providing arms and equipment to Stalin, against Germany. And then when America gets into war as a result of Pearl Harbor, the commitment that President Roosevelt made that America will become and these are his words, the arsenal of democracy. And they will provide. But behind that is the calculation. The calculation is that Russia is absolutely essential in this land war against Germany. And Germany is basically in control of all of Europe except for Britain, that is an island country. Once France has fallen, all of Europe is in control of Germany, and Hitler launches the war against Russia. So in this land war, and at whatever point America comes into this war physically, in this land war, the brunt of that war will be faced by the Russians. For Russians to fight and win this war means American boys will not have to die. So that's the equation, Every Russian soldier dying in this war against Germany, Nazi Germany, means one American less. So just to give the sort of figures, when President Roosevelt arrives in Yalta on February the 11th, the Russian army, Soviet army, has already entered Germany. It is at order. The time period when Roosevelt is at Yalta and starts to head back, in this time period, the Russians have lost over 300,000 men at war, casualties. That figure is the total figure of American casualties, dead, in the entire Second World War in Europe and North Africa. So in a period of 3 weeks, Russia lost more men, more soldiers than America lost throughout Second World War in Europe.
Again, to put it into another perspective, Salim, it was just reported, Douglas McGregor on Tucker Carlson reported that about 450,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed in the current conflict there. And that is more than every single American who died in all of World War II, both theaters of war.
Exactly.
Ukrainians have already lost that number.
Exactly. So now that you raised that issue, 400,000 plus Ukrainians dead in this American-led proxy war against Russia. So the Americans are fighting to the last man, that is the last Ukrainian, to defeat Russia or to weaken Russia or whatever is their ultimate objective is. That is the Biden administration. That is the military-industrial complex. Okay. So yeah, I mean, these numbers are horrendous number. So President Roosevelt going to Yalta to get the commitment of Stalin that he is going to turn around after the defeat of Germany, the surrender of Germany. The German surrender is now a given. It is the end game. When Roosevelt and Stalin and Churchill are talking at Yalta, it is the end game. Roosevelt dies on April the 12th. Hitler commits suicide on April the 30th. And on May 8th, Germany surrenders. Right? So the commitment that Roosevelt is seeking from Stalin, and Stalin gives that commitment, which means that American boys will not have to invade Japan. That is what is on the table. that once Russia army moves across into Japanese-held territory, that is Manchuria in Asia, north of China, once that happens, it is only a matter of time that Japan will surrender. So Truman comes to office and Germany has surrendered. So what is Truman waiting for? Truman is waiting for, and his people, that is the same military commanders that were the Council of Military Advisors, naval advisors to President Roosevelt, is now sitting around Truman, and they are now planning the Japanese end game. And of course, on the table is the question of invading Japan, because up to now, nobody has heard about the gadget. There's no news about the gadget, whether it has come through or not. April, May, there's no word. So the planning proceeds. The planning has to proceed. The planning proceeds. And Truman is advised to call a meeting of the big three. Truman doesn't know Stalin, has never met Stalin. Truman hasn't met Churchill. When President Roosevelt dies and Truman becomes the president, as Truman himself wrote to his daughter, and as other people have pointed out, Truman had no idea of who was America's ambassador in Moscow, for instance. He did not know the people around him who were advising Roosevelt. Okay, so he had to, in quick speed, he had to come up as president to know the people, to get briefed upon all of what had happened and was happening, what was in the pipeline, and so on and so forth. And he was advised, as a matter of fact, Churchill wanted this, to have a meeting. And so the Potsdam meeting was arranged. Germany has surrendered. Potsdam is a suburb outside of Berlin. And there the big three would meet, in a sense of a final discussion, the Japanese war, the end of Japanese war, and also on the issues in Europe, because now there are problems that has emerged between the allies or among the allies, as the Russian army has swept across Eastern Europe and has now, entered Germany. In fact, it is the Russian army, the Red Army, that is controlling Berlin. Germany is going to be divided into sectors: the British sector, the American sector, the Russian sector. Will be divided to control, and the whole future of Eastern Europe is a matter on the table. So I'm focused on the Japanese side. Truman wants this meeting, and Truman heads out after having had his final meeting and discussion in Washington on the planning of the Pacific War. And one of the key things that he's told by General Marshall, who is the chief of staff of the U.S. Army, 5-star general, that once the Russian army moves into Manchuria, once that happens, it will just be a matter of when the Japanese decide to surrender. Unless we also invade Japan, but that decision has not been made. In that briefing, which I cite in my paper, the word that Roosevelt uses, if indicates that no decision has been made. That decision will be made within the context of Russia's invasion of Japan, Russia launching the attack on Japan. In the meantime, what is very critical to understand, there are two things. Both the president, Roosevelt was the president until April, and then Truman steps in. They have all the intercepted cables of Japan. The Japanese code was broken by the Americans very early in the war, before the war or soon after Pearl Harbor. The Americans had broken the code. And so they were reading the traffic of Japanese cables, military and political cable. And they knew the situation by April, what was happening to Japan. What was happening to Japan? Japan was teetering at the edge of disaster. Militarily, Japan was fighting. The Battle of Iwo Jima, which was one of the grim battles that the Americans and the Japanese fought, began when President Roosevelt was still alive and on his way to Yalta. And it ended in March before President Roosevelt died. And Americans won that battle at a very heavy cost. These are the stepping stone towards mainland Japanese island. And the next battle which was equally brutal, was the Battle of Okinawa. And the Battle of Okinawa began on April the 1st and carried on into June after Roosevelt had died. But again, Battle of Okinawa, the Americans took Okinawa at a very heavy cost. And so the cost of those two battles, Battle of Iwo Jima and Battle of Okinawa, was in the minds of President Truman and in the minds of all his military advisors, planning the invasion of Japan. But in the meantime, the naval side of it had put the squeeze on Japan. Basically, Japan was economically being completely crushed. The encirclement of Japan was just about complete. And
if you look up on the bombings of Japan by B-29 bombers from November of 44 up until the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 9 months of basically carpet bombing. And if you look at that circle around Tokyo Bay between Yokohama and Tokyo, it was flattened. It was flattened. More people died, more buildings were destroyed in all of that than in the nuclear bombs. So yes, the entire economics of Japan was destroyed. Its population they had left all the cities. They were hiding in the hills more or less, and the infrastructure was completely destroyed by the bombings by the Americans. So the capitulation of Japan was imminent.
Absolutely. So by April, they were getting the traffic, they were reading the messages. General Curtis LeMay, who was one of the commanders of the bomber squadron, B-29 that you mentioned, and it was his squadron that would be assigned the task for bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki. General Curtis LeMay's squadron or command group, bomber group. General Curtis LeMay informed his superiors, and then his superior, General Arnold, Hap Arnold, the commander or chief of staff of the U.S. Army Air Force, assigned Curtis LeMay to brief the Joint Chiefs of Staff that at the rate of bombing that they were doing, and the fire bombings and the escalated bombing that they were doing, as you said, from late November of 1944 into the summer of 1945, the report was from Curtis LeMay that there was no further target to bomb by the end of summer. There was no target to bomb. They were simply bombing civilian population and so on. There was no military target. So they knew about all of this thing. And then when President Truman with his advisors are on ship to Potsdam, they sail across the Atlantic to England, and then from there they fly to Potsdam, Berlin, out on the outskirts of Berlin. Truman receives the intercepted cable, which is on his table, on the ship from the Japanese foreign minister Togo to the Japanese ambassador in Moscow, Sato, Ambassador Sato, and the cable is saying that the emperor wants the war to come to an end, and that they are sending out peace feelers, which is through Russia, through neutral countries like Switzerland. They're sending out peace feelers for bringing the war to an end. So what is preventing the war to come an end? Why are they not surrendering? So that's the second question. They want a clarification on the term unconditional surrender.
They were so concerned about the monarchy, we would call it, but the emperor's status as a divine emperor. I mean, to the Japanese people, he was God, quite literally a god. And so unless they had some sort of reassurance of the continuation of the emperor, then they would have fought to the last man, and I think it was the recalcitrance, the reluctance of Truman to see that. Maybe he did see it, I don't know, but the reluctance to say, unconditional means that your military unconditionally surrenders, right? But the emperor, I mean, he's the head of the state, so he's the sovereign, so he stays. But no, he didn't say that, did he? And so it prolonged, if anything, it prolonged the war.
In that last major meeting in Washington before they left for Potsdam, General Marshall informed people attending that meeting that if these terms are not clarified, the Japanese will fight till the last man, in defense of their religion, their faith, their history, and so on and so forth. So they were wanting a clarification. The clarification that they needed was that there will not be a removal of the emperor and the end of the institution of the throne. That's how the Japanese put it. So I'm citing their words. Removal of the emperor and the end of the institution of the throne. They wanted that confirmation. It was President Roosevelt in Casablanca in January of 1943, again in one of his foreign meetings. Churchill was present. Stalin did not come to that meeting, but Chiang Kai-shek, the Chinese leader, was at that meeting. President Roosevelt announced that there will be no negotiation. The Axis powers, which is Germany, Italy, and Japan, would have to make an unconditional surrender. Well, one of the reasons, not to get into too much details about it, one of the reasons why President Roosevelt said it has to be an unconditional surrender, because in World War I, the war ended with an armistice. There was no Allied forces on German soil when the war ended on November 11, 1918. It was an armistice. That means it was a ceasefire. And the negotiation then would go into what became the Treaty of Paris, Versailles, But that situation created the mythology that there was a stab in the back. That became the argument of people, especially with Hitler and with the Nazis, that Germany had been betrayed. Germany could still have fought the war. Germany was winning. There was no need to surrender, and so on and so forth. So given that backstory, Roosevelt announced that it has to be an unconditional surrender.
Our demand has been, and it remains, unconditional surrender.
And so Germany was an unconditional surrender, and on May 8th, Hitler blew his brains out, and others along with him, like him, who was it, Goebbels, and so on. Others ran. But in the case of Japan, they wanted. So from April, and then the cable that was on the table of Truman while he is traveling to Potsdam on the ship on July the 12th, and other cables that were being intercepted. The issue was that Japan is at the edge of collapse, teetering. That's the word that Eisenhower used. And it needs a clarification. And just about all his military advisors basically said that, it is time to clarify that. But again, reason unstated. We can speculate, so we're not going to speculate, but reason unstated, Truman did not do that. And the announcement that was made, that is the Potsdam Declaration of July 26, which marked the end of the conference, and Truman would leave on August the 1st. The Potsdam Declaration basically said unconditional surrender, and all of the people responsible for the atrocities and the wars and so on and so forth will be held accountable. So the Japanese, reading the Potsdam Declaration, for them, it was clear that there was no exception being made for the emperor. The issue of the emperor and the throne was not mentioned in any form in the Potsdam Declaration. Okay. Well, Potsdam Declaration is also a problem now that we know, not in terms of what the Americans stated. It was signed by Truman, Churchill, and the Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek. But there was no mention of Russia. Well, on July 26th, Russia is still, in a sense, with a non-aggression pact against Japan. So Russia is not at war with Japan. But Truman knew, because when Truman arrived in Potsdam on July the 16th, Truman arrives, and on the same day, in the evening of July the 16th, Truman is brought a cable by his Secretary of War, Stimson, about the Trinity test that has taken place in the morning, 5:30 in the morning in New Mexico, Alamogordo, and it has been successful. The baby is born. That was the code word. So the gadget has been successful. The time difference, 5:30 in the morning in New Mexico was about 7-8 hours in Europe in the afternoon. Stimson, on getting the cable, immediately walked over to Truman, where Truman was staying, and gave him the message that it's been all successful. So now you have, on July the 16th, Truman knows what Roosevelt did not know, because Roosevelt died before the Trinity test. Truman knows that there is a bomb available now, the A bomb. And so he will have a decision to make. Truman knows, because the next day, July 17th, Stalin arrives in Potsdam from Moscow. And the first thing he does on arrival, he walks over to where Truman is residing. And he has that first handshake with Truman. Churchill is not present. So it is only Truman and Stalin. They have the first handshake. Truman invites him to join him for lunch. Stalin stays behind. And in that first conversation, Stalin tells Truman that I've come to tell you that we will keep our promise to Roosevelt. We are going to launch the invasion of Manchuria, that's Japan. Truman asks him what date. Stalin tells him August 15th. So again, on the timeline, and Truman makes a note in his personal diary, and he writes, Japs Finney. Truman is going to, that it's over. 15th, it is going to be all over. He knows that. Stalin has told him. So he has the information from Stalin that Stalin will launch the operation on August 15. He has the information now from his Secretary of War that the Manhattan Project has delivered the baby. The Trinity test has been successful. He has a decision to make. And according to his diary and according to his biographers, Truman makes the decision on July the 24th that he's going
that's before the 26th
24th,
Potsdam
the Potsdam Declaration.
Yeah, that's 2 days before the Potsdam Declaration. It's almost as like his mind was made up.
Yeah, he makes up
what
his
the
mind.
Japanese are going to do. He knew that they would not accept unconditional surrender in the Potsdam Declaration. So he decided 2 days even before that to drop the bomb on them.
Exactly. So he has made this decision. He has, of course, not communicated this to anybody else. This is the decision that he has made. Why the date July the 24th? Because on July the 24th happens the meeting of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the combined Joint Chiefs of Staff, Churchill, Truman, and their respective military commanders. And in that meeting, there is a discussion about how to end the war, what will happen. Truman does not at that moment express that he is going to use the bomb. That is still his guarded secret. But that meeting is followed by the Big Three meeting, in which Stalin and his commanders join. So now it is the three allied powers are having their meeting. The morning meeting was with Churchill. The afternoon meeting, the plenary session, is with Stalin. And after that meeting is over, Truman walks up to Stalin and says to Stalin in a private conversation, with no one present except their interpreters, he tells Stalin, we have now a very powerful new explosive weapon. That's all that he tells him. And Stalin responds, I hope you make good use of it.
Well, unbeknownst, I guess, perhaps to Truman, is that Stalin was already aware of it because there were spies in the United States that have already told
So Stalin does not reveal that he knew about it. Why? I mean, then of course there will be suspicion on the other side. Stalin just does not act surprised, doesn't say anything. That's the mask. He wears a mask, but Stalin doesn't know that Truman has made the decision, because that's in his diary that he had made the decision. He's going to use it.
And not only did he make the decision, Salim, but he made the decision to drop the bomb. What did he say? Anytime after August 2nd, which would have been before the planned invasion of Manchuria by Russia.
Right. And so the question is, why August the 2nd? Because when he gets all of these information, and he has taken all the information, and it is the president's decision to make. He makes the decision. He receives the cable from his Secretary of War, Stimson, who, after advising Truman that the Manhattan Project is now successful, he is no longer required to stay in Potsdam. He flies back to Washington, because he's the cabinet officer under whom the Manhattan Project is launched. It is in the Secretary of War's responsibility. So he's back in Washington, and he's advised by the people running the Manhattan Project, that is General Leslie Grove and others, that everything is ready. They have 2 bombs ready to be transported to the Pacific to be used if that's the decision of the president. So he cables Truman that everything is now ready. It is your decision. And Truman cables back not before August 2nd. So August 2nd, he will be in the ship going back to Washington. He leaves Potsdam on August 1st. So he doesn't want to be in Potsdam or in Europe when the bomb is used, So not before August 2nd. So the time difference is the preparation, getting the bomb into the Pacific, island where the bomber squadrons are based, and so on and so forth. So that's the date. But all of this decision is the president's decision. General Douglas MacArthur, who is the top military commander in the Pacific, General Eisenhower is the top military commander in Europe. General Eisenhower was advised by Stimson at the Potsdam Conference after the word came back from the Manhattan Project on the Trinity test, July 16. He was advised, now that they know about it, the military commanders in Potsdam is informed about this result. All of them did not know about the Manhattan Project. Only General Marshall knows about it because he's the chief of staff. Secretary of War knows about it. And the people under General Marshall who's running the Manhattan Project, they are the ones who are responsible. But General Eisenhower is the field commander. He comes to Potsdam. So after 16th, as I pointed out, it is from the records, both from the biography of Eisenhower and from the minutes of the meetings of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Stimson advises Eisenhower about the atomic bomb and tells him that, it is under consideration now. This is Truman's decision, the president's decision, what will happen. And Eisenhower, as he writes, and then as he states, he listens to all of this in utter dejection, and he's shaking his head, and he says, after Stimson is finished, he says, "This is all unnecessary. Japan is beaten, and this is going to leave." Is going to go against the public opinion, the world public opinion, and the morality of America and its moral position, and so on.
Well, it turns out, Salim, that at the time, after the Second World War, immediately after, when the people, after VJ Day, almost 9 out of 10 Americans applauded the decision of Truman to do that. However, that approval rating of that decision steadily dropped over the following years, where people started to have doubts about the whole thing.
In the immediate context, it was almost as high as 90%.
Yeah.
But 50 years later, as more information came out, it flipped over. It was down to somewhere around about 50% range, the support for the use of the bomb. But in the context of that moment, all the military commanders, except for General Marshall, who was a very strict officer in terms of protocol, the decision to use the bomb is a political decision, not a military decision, because they've all told the president that Japan is basically finished, is teetering at it. And so all of them, for instance, General Curtis LeMay said that, it was only going to be a matter of whether they surrender a week before or a week after. So he was asked why was it bombed, and why did he was the commander of the squadron of the wing that Enola Gay, the B-29 that dropped the bomb in Hiroshima. Why did you all do it? And LeMay says directly, I was ordered to do it by President Truman, and we did it. That's
there's James Burns, the Secretary of State, who gave one reason why it was done, and that, of course, is to put the fear of God into Russia for the United States. But I wonder if there's not, now that we know politicians the way we do, they're no longer the revered figures of the past. I wonder if there wasn't a political decision by Truman, who was not elected as president, but only as a vice president, and he had a looming election 3 years later, would this have been a way for Truman to put a definitive stamp on the victory in the Pacific with his name on it? Because if Japan had surrendered within a week or so, as the generals were saying, without the bomb, then Truman really couldn't have said that this was because of me. I didn't make any of these decisions. This was all the war from December 41 right up to this point under Roosevelt, except for the last couple of months, 3 months. But because he came out and says, I made this decision to drop the bomb and end the war early and save American troops, that smacks to me as being totally political and totally self-serving to help him get elected at the first time, that the next election's 3 years hence. What do you think?
Well, political decisions, there are so many variables at play, and your sense of speculating on what was going on partly in the mind of Truman cannot be dismissed. I mean, that it is politics. I mean, this was 45. He will be running for president in 48 election. He will have to stand up and face these issues, and there will be many other issues that will be faced. But now, in 45, summer of 45, the decision that he makes is that he's going to bomb it. The people around him, none of them signed on to this matter in the manner in which they said, yes, President, this has to be done. What the record says is very calm, calculating thinking. What is the necessity? This was unnecessary. That was almost a unanimous opinion of the people around him. The senior most officer in the American Armed Forces in the Second World War was Admiral of the Fleet, William Lehigh. He was the chief of staff for Roosevelt, and then he was the chief of staff for Truman. And he's on record that when the cable arrived on his table on the morning that Hiroshima was bombed, he turned around to his secretary, Dorothy, and said, Dorothy, we will regret this. This will come back to haunt us because we don't make war on women and children.
Yeah.
This was Admiral Lehigh. All the other admirals, there were 3 other, 5-star admirals. There was, he's one, Lehigh, then Admiral Ernest King, Admiral Nimitz, who was the commander of the Navy in the Pacific, and Admiral Halsey. All these admirals were of the opinion that Japan was finished. It was just a matter of, time when they would surrender. And the commitment of Stalin was right there on the paper, which is what happened. He bombed. He chose the date August the 6th. I mean, the military commanders on the field, they got ready, and so August the 6th was the day that Hiroshima was bombed in the morning. 3 days later, August the 9th, the Russian army had invaded Manchuria. That means Stalin brought the dates forward. He had said 15th. His army was launched on August the 9th.
I wonder whether or not that was, as a result, a consequence of the dropping of the bomb in Hiroshima. It advanced the clock for Russia, because Russia, if I'm reading your paper right, and the history is that Russia wanted Lower Sakhalin, Southern Sakhalin Island, and the Kuril Islands. That they lost Southern Sakhalin before, and they wanted the Kuril Islands. But they perhaps would have perceived that, the dropping of these bombs might precipitate a surrender early, so that we can't get into the war and we can't reclaim the Sakhalin Island. Could that be?
Well, yeah, I mean that is very much on the table for discussion. From the point of view of what was going on inside the head of Stalin, but what was going on inside the head of the Stalin, all of that, plus the fact that America, the ally of Moscow in this war, has preempted and done something in which the Russians have not been consulted or advised.
Hmm.
You see, and so that's the beginning of the breakup of a relationship. The critical question in all of this is, what would Roosevelt have done? Because every bit of information that is on the table with Truman, for Truman to make the decision that he did on July the 24th, all of that information would be on the table for Roosevelt. And so what decision Roosevelt would make? Well, again, historians are in some sense, have different perspective based upon the records of the people around Roosevelt, who were then people around Truman. And one of the key points that is made is that Roosevelt would have done the same thing, is that Roosevelt had authorized the expenditure for the Manhattan Project, which was now over $2 billion. And he would use the bomb to demonstrate that, this money was not wasted and so on and so forth. The Congress has to be presented with the evidence, of what was this expenditure of $2 billion, a massive amount of money. So that's the opinion of Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War for Roosevelt. He says that Roosevelt would have used the bomb. That's the opinion of the people who were Truman's people, like Secretary Byrne and his subsequent biographers, and maybe Truman himself, that, Roosevelt would have used it. So if I don't use it, then people will hold me responsible. Why wasn't it used to end the war, and so on and so forth.
But isn't it the proper question, not that would I use an atomic bomb in war to end the war, which I would consider to be a moral decision? Yes. Japan was the aggressor. A defending nation can use whatever means that they have, including nuclear weapons, to stop it. But would Roosevelt have used it knowing that Japan was just about to capitulate? That's a different question, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. And that's the nub of the matter. I mean, what the question you're using. As I said, all the information that Truman had between April and end of July that he makes the decision, if Roosevelt had lived, he would have been the president. Those would be the same decision. So my point is, and a critical point from my perspective, is that Roosevelt would listen to people like Eisenhower or Douglas MacArthur or the commanders of the United States Army, Air Force, telling, Mr. President, the job is done. And Roosevelt knows that Stalin is committed to launch the war in Manchuria. He also has the date. Stalin has given him the date, 3 months, and we will be there. And he has all the cable. The Japanese are asking for terms of surrender, unconditional surrender. What does it mean? Clarification and so on. And so, in my view, he would listen to the people around him. The military people would be saying the war is basically over. Japan is teetering. You don't hammer somebody with an atom bomb when he's already, dead, so to speak, metaphorically. But more importantly, Roosevelt would have listened to those people who would have said to him, Mr. President, would you not take into consideration what would be Stalin's response? How this would affect the Russian? And I say that because this is, again, based on record. It is not speculation. In the Washington meetings, the Secretary of War had, with the consultation of the President and the President's authorization, that is Truman's authorization, because the situation had changed when the Manhattan Project was reaching towards the testing of the Trinity test. Stimson asked to establish an interim committee of a select group of people, handpicked people, politicians and scientists or technical advisors, to advise the president, once the bomb is available, how to proceed, both in terms of its application and in terms of the management of it, for the future, the research side, the funding side, the security side, and so on. So the whole complex situation that emerges with this new weapon. And in that interim committee meeting, just before President Truman left for Potsdam, the matter of the use of the bomb when it is available was discussed, but it was discussed in the context of the Trinity test. The test had not taken place yet. So people were preparing and getting ready when the test will take place. And, that test took place when Truman was on the way to Potsdam and had arrived on Potsdam on July the 16th. But this meeting was taking place in between. And in that meeting, General Marshall proposed that we should invite a Soviet to come and witness the test. He asked for 2 Soviet. He said it would be good to have 2 Soviet military personnel or scientists to be present at the test. Now, this is a very secret private discussion going on, but it's all on the record now, available. Secretary Byrne vetoed the decision. The man who would become the Secretary of State, Byrne, vetoed the decision. Okay, so it is what I'm drawing from this, the inference from this. General George Marshall would not make such a statement on record that let's invite a Soviet to come and witness the test if these discussions had not taken place with President Roosevelt about what and how we will deal with the Soviets after we have the test and the bomb. During the making of it, it was all secret. But once it explodes, it's no longer secret.
This is reminding me of Trump, believe it or not, in diplomacy. Regardless of the ruthlessness of the allies that you have to have in order to win a war, Stalin was no nice guy, 60 million dead under his regime. We have Roosevelt, who understands the diplomacy of nations, regardless of their ideologies and their cultures. He understands the diplomacy and trying to keep them into the loop so that there is not a major war again, which is why he starts the United Nations, or wanted to start the United Nations. And look at Donald Trump. What did he do? Just before he was inaugurated, he sat down with Obama, and what did Obama say? You're going to go to war with North Korea. And Trump said, have you talked to the man, Kim Jong-un? No, he's a dictator. And so what does Trump do when he gets into the office? He calls up Kim Jong-un, and they meet, and they shake hands across the border. War is averted, ostensibly because Trump knows about the diplomacy of nation states, regardless of the brutality of Un, or Kim. So this is fascinating because Truman seemed to have a different notion of diplomacy with Russia. He was always thinking how to outwit them, how to make them come in line in Europe by dropping the bomb on Japan and having them fare them. While Roosevelt, I think, after reading your paper and learning a bit more about it, would have possibly been a little bit more open and forward to the Soviets and possibly avoided an Iron Curtain and a Cold War. who knows? Again, it's speculative, but I think you do have some points that are definitely intriguing for this thought exercise about what would Roosevelt have done.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is a very broad discussion, but the quick point is that my conclusion is that Roosevelt would not have gone in the direction of using the bomb, and of course, Roosevelt is a different personality, a man who won 4 elections, considered the greatest statesman, American statesman of the 20th century. I'm talking about the Americas. I mean, I'm a Canadian, you're a Canadian, other people from outside of America might have different opinion. But here is a completely different man. I mean, people have pointed out, historians have pointed out, students of American politics have pointed out, like Seymour Martin Lipset, that the 3 greatest president are George Washington, the man who led the Continental Army to victory in the making of the United States of America after the 1776 Revolution. Then you have Abraham Lincoln, who preserved the Union. And then you have in the 20th century Roosevelt, who saved America, brought America out of the Depression, saved capitalism, and became the arsenal of democracy in the greatest war. So, well, that's the record. That's the judgment of American scholars, authors, and so on and so forth. And I go along with that, and personality is politics. President Roosevelt is, in that sense, a giant. Historians have called when Truman was sworn in to the office and subsequently that he's a neophyte and he had to learn, and so on and so forth. So he was surrounded by people and he took their advice. And I think the most critical and crucial people around him were his soulmates, his political mentors and political companions. The military gave him one advice, but the others, because he's going to go back to Washington, his administration will be faced with political decisions after the war, how it was handled, and so on and so forth. And Churchill was, I think, very critical in this decision making. And so the decision was that Russia is going to be very difficult to handle. Once we display that we have the bomb, we might be able to, control Russia, in a sense, deter Russia, and make Russia cower in fear that, if Russia pushes too hard, there will be retaliation, that there will be costs. The dynamics had changed, so to speak. I don't think Roosevelt would have done that. I think Roosevelt was committed to securing peace on the basis of an understanding with Russia. It is not about America's business to go on and convert Russia into democracy, liberal democracy, Jeffersonian democracy. That is the people of Russia and Russians are going to do. That is George Bush, talk, and Clinton talk, and Obama talk. No, I mean, Roosevelt had a whole different approach to this matter. And that was his baby, United Nations in League. And so with Roosevelt, whether Roosevelt would have informed Stalin, sat with Stalin, talked with Stalin about the bomb after the Trinity test, is again to some extent speculative, but he would not have used the bomb, because the use of the bomb was, as Einstein, as Blackett, as so many other people have pointed out, including Eisenhower, who, by the way, became the next president after Truman, two-term president, a war hero, the man who won the war in Europe. General Marshall was the chief of staff, but General Eisenhower was the supreme commander on the land, on the ground. And he then becomes president. And twice as president, he was advised to use the bomb, and twice he said no. One on the question of Dien Bien Phu, to save the French from a disaster in the war against the Vietnamese, the Viet Congs, Ho Chi Minh, and the second time to use the bomb over China in terms of the conflict over the Straits of Formosa. Eisenhower said no, and Eisenhower is the man who then advises the American people on leaving the White House about the military-industrial complex. So I come back to, I mean, that's the background. The use of the bomb, in a sense, was the first shot in the Cold War. And what was the Cold War then? In a flip of a switch, the ally became the enemy. That's warfare, you know. And so if you make somebody the enemy, that enemy is also going to make you the enemy. And that's the split takes place, which is what Roosevelt worked to avoid happening, you know, in his lifetime, and which his son holds the testimony to, because his son Elliott Roosevelt was with his father in many of these meetings, and he heard his father, and his father confided to him. So where does it bring us all to? Well, it is under Truman that after the bomb, that the Congress passes the law to create the national security state. You know, to create the Department of Defense, to unify the armed forces under the Secretary of Defense, but most importantly, to put in place all that alphabet soup of intelligence that came about. You know, the CIA was constructed by the Congress, approval of the Congress under Truman. And so when Eisenhower says the military-industrial complex, he's referring to this growth of this fourth branch of government that is not in the Constitution, but that this fourth branch of government would become even more powerful because it will be operating in secrecy. It will be engaging in covert actions. It will be run by the military-industrial complex in the sense the money that is going to be circulated through, the immense amount of money that will go into the defense establishment on the basis of the whole new weapon system that has emerged. You have the A-bomb in 1945, you're going to have the H-bomb a few years later, you know, and the expansion of the nuclear forces, which will be matched by the Soviets. I mean, what was the message of the A-bomb in 1945 when it was used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Stalin immediately told his scientific establishment, the man who was running it, Igor Kurchatov, I want this bomb, whatever you need, get it as fast as possible. Within 4 years, the Soviets had the bomb, A-bomb in 1949.
And now they outsurpass the United States, both in the power of the bomb with the Tsar Bomba and the number of nuclear weapons. They outnumber the United States.
Yeah, but that race had begun. That's exactly what was the concern about arms race and a whole new world with great danger. What Oppenheimer said, we will be like two scorpions in a bottle. And one scorpion can't sting the other because then the other scorpion stings. You know, both of them are dead. To learn to live, to coexist, peaceful coexistence, that what it demands is to really seriously engage in nuclear disarmament. Well, that was the decision of Kennedy.
Yes. Look what happened to him.
The military-industrial complex killed him.
Yeah.
Because they saw that if this man gets reelected, he is going to go ahead with this program, you know, of disarmament on the one side, and on the other side of ending proxy wars. The first proxy war after the A-bomb was used was Korea. We don't have the time to get into the Korean War, but Korean War is a residue of the Second World War. The Korean Peninsula was occupied by the Japanese. The Koreans now wanted to get liberated, and they were fighting for. One half of Korea was communist. One half, mean one giant body of Koreans were supported by Soviet Union, and then the Chinese. The Chinese that President Roosevelt supported, Chiang Kai-shek, the Chinese nationalist government, they lost the Civil War. Now, to win that Civil War, would Americans send their boys to fight for Chiang Kai-shek against the Chinese communists? Obviously, no.
And most Americans would have to look it up on a map.
But the proxy wars are necessary to keep the military-industrial complex going. And then the next proxy war was the Vietnam War. 15 years of that warfare. Kennedy had signed the National Security Action Memorandum 263 only 4 or 5 weeks before he died, to bring back 1,000 Americans from Vietnam. And then in the second term, that would be the slogan, all out by 65, the balance of the Americans would be out of Vietnam, end the Vietnam, have peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union, begin the nuclear disarmament, which he started with a limited test ban treaty, and he was killed.
Yeah.
Then you have the next president, the 45th president, coming around and saying, we have the deep state. Now we all understand the deep state. This is the fourth branch of government run because of the military-industrial complex, a government of the military-industrial complex, by the military-industrial complex, for the military-industrial complex, a complete perversion of what was Lincoln's statement, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people.
You remember just this a couple of days ago at this recording, Tucker Carlson asked Donald Trump, aren't you afraid that they're going to kill you? And his response was that they're savages.
Yes.
They are savages. So yes, the answer is basically yes, they could very well do that. And he's prepared for that. But yeah, they are savages.
Truman has now completely derailed. America is not the America that was America under Roosevelt. If one wants to understand how did America get derailed from being a constitutional republic, what George Washington in his farewell address said, don't get entangled in the affairs of the world. That was it is. They're the old world, What John Adams and his son, John Quincy Adams, said, we don't go out in search of monsters to destroy. We are the beacon of freedom. It is our freedom that we protect, that maintains the light of what it means as a free country, as a free people, as a constitutional republic, for the rest of the world to emulate. It is for the rest of the world to do what is necessary if they want to follow us. But we don't go out, breaking heads of others, which is what George Bush, the 43rd, was talking about, Jeffersonian democracy, on making the Afghan people become Jeffersonian Democrats.
Or the Iraqis. It's just hilarious.
Right, or the billions now that is being spent by United States, including NATO countries like Canada, to make Ukraine the most corrupt country in the world into a Jeffersonian democracy. It is a laundromat for the military-industrial complex in America. So that was what motivated me to go into this rabbit hole. How did this happen? It didn't happen overnight. What happened was the derailment began with the decision of Truman against the consensual view of his closest military advisors.
Yeah.
And today you have those professional military advisors who nobody pays attention to in Washington, people like Colonel Douglas MacGregor, saying, what are we doing in Ukraine? Or diplomats like the late George Kennan, what are we doing advancing NATO membership into Eastern Europe when there is no more Soviet Union, when the Cold War is over?
Excellent point, Salim.
Doing in Ukraine, when the lesson of Cuba was that we are not going to, that's American, I'm using the word we, the Americans, we are not going to tolerate Cuba being an outpost of the communists of the Soviet Union, less than 100 miles from America. So we were ready, that is, Americans were ready to go eyeball to eyeball with Khrushchev to engage in a nuclear war if the missiles were not removed from Cuba, which was. So what are we doing? Don't we understand that the Russians have this similar security interest on their borders?
They don't seem to care. They're savages.
They're savages.
The American government, that is, not necessarily Russia, but
that is the people who live off the military-industrial complex. And what until now we haven't said, maybe this is the wrap-up, the neocons who have taken over America, but they began taking over America with Truman.
That, Salim, is a topic for another day. I'd love to get into it. And as they say, the rest is history. So thank you very much for the article. Food for thought, great intellectual ammunition against the deep state. And thank you very much.
Thank you.